Welcome to Mysteries of Superstition Mountain. I'm Larry Hedrick, where we bring the past into the present for our future viewers. Today we have another great story by Hank Sheffer.
When I came to Apache Junction, Arizona, I didn't just wind up in Apache Junction. I came back here in 1981, and there was nothing arbitrary about it. It was completely by design that I came to Apache Junction. I had been here years before in the 60s after my Navy years, and I had learned then that Apache Junction at one time had been a stagecoach trail that led to the nearby Superstition Mountains. The Odom, Jud, Akimal, Otem, which was Pima, Papago, and Hohokam were some of the people who had tribal ties to the area at one time or another. However, most scholars believe the petroglyphs were created by the Hohokam Indians, who lived in the area roughly 1,500 years ago. The whole Western intrigue thing was wonderful, and it was beyond belief for me, and I felt right at home. So why Arizona, you ask? Well, when I was a youngster growing up back east, I remember my mom and dad asking me what I wanted to be when I grew up. That's kind of funny, when I grew up. Even then, I knew that unless you had aspirations of becoming the president, which I didn't, there were only three things that boys my age wanted to be back then. They were firemen, policemen, and of course, there were cowboys. They were all heroes, but I knew that I wanted to be a cowboy. Arizona just seemed like the place where I needed to be. One of the first places I heard about when I got here, and it became number one on my list of places to visit, was Apache Springs. In this mystic place was supposedly what was known as the Apache or Indian bathtub, and there were all those mysterious markings on the walls of the canyon that had been left by early Native American inhabitants from more than 1,000 years before. Hieroglyphic Canyon, that was the place I wanted to go to. It was located in the southwest end of the Superstition Mountain Range, but it wasn't always known by the name of Apache Springs. That was the original name. Some sources say the name was changed to Hieroglyphic Canyon shortly after the turn of the 20th century. The prolific writer, historian Will Robinson, in his book, History of Arizona, referred to Apache Springs as early as 1918. I'm sure the old ranchers knew where the locations were and probably had names of their own for all of them. But there were no formal names back then, not for these cowboys out there in the mountains. Talk about early cowboys, freighters, and other pioneers in the mountains. All of these guys, they knew where they were going, and they had names for the things that they used as landmarks, but they didn't necessarily show up on maps. And other sources say that Apache Springs appeared on maps as late as 1939. I have to say here, as we've seen with so many other topics about the Superstition Mountains, there just is never one version of any story that we're discussing, and the Hieroglyphic Canyon is no different. However, when it comes to talking about who changed the name of the canyon, we do have a few clues as to who may have made the change. Pearl Bates, or William N. King, could have named the canyon during the war years 1941 to 1945. One or the other was probably Pearl Bates, according to Tom Collenborn. And Collenborn knew these people, so I'll take his word on it. He was the one who passed the hieroglyphic name on to Julian King after December of 1945. Whoever the genius was that called the writings on these ancient walls hieroglyphics I believe did so because it seemed like the thing to do to add intrigue to the desert country around Dinosaur Mountain. Or he simply just didn't know what the hell he was talking about. Unfortunately, whatever the reason, the name change was a complete misnomer, and the misinformation created confusion for our Southwest scholars as well as Egyptologists way back then. Petroglyphs are indigenous to the American Southwest. Hieroglyphics, well, we know where they come from, don't we? Don't we? It just sounds like just one more fiction writer trying to make a buck out there somewhere to me. Anyway, nevertheless, Apache Springs exhibits some of the best examples of petroglyphs in the entire range of the Superstition Mountain. Animals, antelope, sheep, deer, snakes, and lizards. It also has some geometric-like patterns in the mix. These animals are all over the place. And they were significant to Native Americans' diet, and the geometric shapes may well have had some significance to their religions at the time. These amazing petrographs are located about 1.5 miles east of Kings Ranch Resort off Kings Ranch Road. Today, there is a large paved parking lot at the east end of Cloudview Road. The hike itself is a pleasant, easy 2.8-mile walk. On some winter weekends, the parking lot is filled to capacity, and I know I just went up there the other day and I couldn't even get in. It was so packed. But you go up there and check it out, and it's worth the wait. There are numerous other areas with petroglyphs in the mountain, but they are not so easily reached as the Hieroglyphic Canyon is. They would take some serious homework and planning to get to there, and maybe even a guide if you don't know the mountain. Let me tell you a little story about the first venture I had up in the Hieroglyphic Canyon. When I arrived in Apache Junction, one of the first places I happened to come across was the Apacheland Movie Studios. It was located at the base of the Superstition Mountain out Peralta Road. This was perfect. I was allowed to step back into the 1800s, crack out of the box, and with a vengeance. I loved it. I soon wangled my way into working, if you want to call it work, with the gunfighters and participating in their shows. I also learned that the trail to those petroglyphs we talked about could be accessed right off the Apacheland property. After I was at Apacheland for a little while, I met an old Indian gentleman by the name of Papa Jim Fire Eagle. He was 77 years young that particular year, but you'd have never guessed it to look at him. He was spry as he could be and sharp as a tack. Papa Jim, Little Beaver, and Little Beaver's wife, Snowflower, came to see the petroglyphs. Jim had never seen them, and he wanted to see them just as badly as I did. As we traveled up the relatively flat trail, he explained how to spot where camps had been, and dammit piles. Now, dammit piles, we all have those. If we've ever done any kind of craft at all, you've had those situations where you're working with something, and all of a sudden you say, oh, damn it, and you throw it down, and you do it over again. What you threw on the ground, that's called your dammit pile. Well, the Indian did the same thing if he was making arrowheads or whatever, or pottery or whatever, and it broke or something, he just, damn it, and he threw it in a pile. And they became known as dammit piles. Now, once we arrived at the canyon, Jim was like a hungry dog in a meat locker. He scrutinized every one of the writings. He said, a lot. He just smiled, that all-knowing smile. And then we took a lunch break. He never explained anything. He just, And then we took that lunch break. Snowflower made some drawings and notes as we all sat eating our lunch, which consisted of traditional Indian cuisine, peanut butter and jelly sandwiches that we'd taken with us. During our conversation, I mentioned that my wife's, at the time, her name was Whipple. Now, Whipple was kind of interesting because there was a Lieutenant Whipple at Fort Whipple out here in this area. And I said that she was part Indian. I said, it's kind of interesting because Lieutenant Whipple was back here when all the Indians and the cavalry was fighting, and they was carrying on like that and shooting and killing each other and carrying on. And Jim looked at me with a kind of a twinkle in his eye, and he said, well, it just goes to show you all them Indians wasn't fighting, was they? Well, that trip had been quite an adventure. After returning to Apacheland, after the sandwiches, and it was starting to get dark, so we came back to the movie ranch, and we sat around drinking a pot of coffee. It was a Papa Jim pot of coffee, and his coffee was just black as Cooley's dog. I tell you, it was just black coffee. You could tell when it was done because you could float a spoon in it. It was it was tough stuff, but it wasn't bad. We got through it. After that, we called it a day, and I went home. My head was just spinning with all the wonderful things I had learned that day, things I never had any idea about. Now, just because it's the nature of the beast, in Apache Junction, it doesn't take long to get all wrapped up in the Lost Dutchman gold and treasure legends. They seem to permeate out of every rock crevice and cactus and any old timer surrounding this area. They're always shrouded by the mountains that you can see in untold secrets. And I was no different in that regard. I was wrapped up in it all of a sudden. I met some amazing people after I arrived here. I wound up dealing with celebrities. I dealt with just all sorts of wonderful things, and people who had been on the mountain, people who'd written books, which prompted me to write a book or two or three. And there was just so much that I had to learn, and I just soaked it up like a sponge. I want to tell you that you're invited to come out here and visit Arizona. I've had so many comments from folks out there from all over the planet. You're welcome to come out here and enjoy some of the adventures on your own. Superstition Mountain's still sitting there, just like she always was. On a final note, I would personally like to remind everyone wanting to make the quest to our area here in Arizona, and especially to Apache Springs. The unique thing about this ancient canyon is that it provides us with a peek into the past, and we can walk the quiet desert into an ancient art gallery created by people who walked the very same steps that we are now walking over 1,000 years ago. My trip was over 35 years ago, but ever since then, the mountain and its petrographs have remained beautiful and visible for all these many years. My hope is that when you go to visit, you too will appreciate and protect what you see and leave the scene just as you found it. And while you're at it, you might also want to ponder the thought that we still do today. We still don't know what these mysterious writings on the mountain have to say. And that's why they remain just another mystery of the Superstition Mountains. Thank you for watching this episode of Mysteries of the Superstition Mountains.